Michael, my name is Con Hogan. I live here in Clonmel, originally from near Tipperary town, and formerly worked with Merck Sharp and Owen and retired now for a number of years. Very involved in the GAA. I was chairman of the Tipperary County Board in my time, and still involved with Semple Stadium, and still active generally in the community.
And where were you born and reared?
I was born and reared in a place called Roseborough, between Tipperary and Letton. The house where I was born and where we lived was originally a Dalton home. My grandfather, Tom Hogan, married into Mary Dalton, and sadly both of them died in 1918 of the Great Flu within a week of each other, and left their children as orphans. So I suppose Hogan and Dalton families were very connected through nationalism. The Daltons were a very old national family in Tipperary town, and the Hogans were from farming people from Ardavalane outside Tip, and very involved in nationalist activities, going right back through kind of support for Parnell and the repeal movement and all that. So I suppose they were kind of kindred spirits, and I suppose that's how they came together.
And is that family home still there?
No, well, it's still there, but it was so my family, my father, eventually inherited the place, and we sold that farm. It was a small farm, and we sold that farm in 1964 and moved to Capel-White. And I'd be more identified with Capel-White now than near Tipperary. Although I only lived a short time there. I moved to Dublin in 1966 and joined the Air Corps as an apprentice, and as they say, the rest is history.
And what's the connection with the Maloney's?
My great-grandfather, my mother was Maloney, and her grandfather was P.J. Maloney. Now, the Maloneys were from Guttrum. They're from the parish of Salahead, going back to the kind of 1600s. And my immediate great-grandfather, P.J. Maloney, was born in Guttrum in 1869, and one of a family of 13. Families were big that time. And he went to school in Tipperary town, and went on then to train as a pharmacist in Limerick, where he met his wife. His wife was a widow. She had 4 children. She was a Mrs. Hannon. She was originally O'Brien from Nina. And Ellen Hannon married P.J. Maloney and had 4 children. 4 children were May, Jim, Con, who was my grandfather, and I'm called after him, and Pat. And they were all born in Limerick. And around 1910, PJ came back to Tipperary town and set up a pharmacy business in Tipperary, on the corner of Church Street and Main Street, where the Maid of Erin statue is now. And in fact, there's a plaque there to the Maloney family. So PJ was, again, a very, very active supporter of Parnell and of Home Rule, and but completely changed his way of thinking in 1914 when the Parliamentary Party and Redmond opted to support Britain in the Great War and supported the suspension of Home Rule. PJ was vehemently opposed to that, and very much threw his lot in with Sinn Féin at that time, and became one of the organisers of Sinn Féin in Tipperary, along with Louis Dalton, who was again a relation of mine on the Hogan side, and Louis and he became connected through marriage later on, and I'll talk about that in a little while. So PJ became very involved in Sinn Féin and was arrested after the 1916 rising. A lot of the Sinn Féin people around the country were rounded up after the 1916 rising, PJ among them, and spent time in Scotland, interned in Scotland, and was released later that year. And he wrote a jail journal, which only came to light in the last couple of years. Really very interesting because it's a contemporaneous account of how he thought at that time. It was discovered in the British Army or the British archives in Kew only a few years ago. And I'm his great grandson, and he's another great grandson who's a noted historian, Trinity historian, and he kind of publicised it, and if you like, somebody in his department discovered it. Ewan O'Halpin is the name of that historian. So Ewan and I would be second cousins. We would be the same relation of P.J. Maloney. So then when the after 1916, when he came back to Tip, PJ became very involved in the organisation of Sinn Féin, which had been established in the Rotunda in Dublin, I think in 1913. And Louis Dalton became president of Sinn Féin in Tipperary town, and PJ was secretary. And indeed, my own grandfather, Tom Hogan, who subsequently, as I said, died in 1918, was the vice chairman. So they were all very involved, and I suppose my family involvement couldn't have been deeper from all sides. So he operated his business in Church Street as a pharmacist, and as I say, was very active in the formation of Sinn Féin.
What year was that, Con?
Well, from after 1916 right along, and they became involved, very much involved. Then you see, with as we know, you had the part of the fallout from the Great War, and the split in the volunteers, and you had the National Volunteers split, and he went with the smaller group. The major part of the volunteers supported Redmond and went on to fight in the Great War, many of them. But the group that became known as the Irish Volunteers were very much supporting independence and were prepared to fight for that. And he was involved in the setting up of the volunteers, the Irish Volunteers, very actively in Tipperary town, as were his sons.
How old was he at this stage?
Well, there you are. He was older than most of them. Like he was born in 1869, so he would have been what? He would have been
46,
in his late 30s, isn't that right? In 1916. So 30. He would have been more. He would have been 47 or 8. So he was an elder person, way older obviously than all the people who were involved in the formation of the volunteers, like Sean Tracy, Dan Breen, were the Morris Crow. They were the prime movers into Prairie Town. The Maloney brothers, the Barlows, the Fitzpatricks. They were all young. They were the kids really when you think of it. Like in 1916, my grandfather mobilised, actually, the Galtee Battalion mobilised. A thing that's not generally known. A group mobilised here in Clonmel and they're commemorated. But a group mobilised in Tipperary as well. They were known as the Galtee Battalion at that time. And Con, he was only 19, but obviously he was one of the leaders at the time. So Sean Tracy was very young as well. You know, when you think of it, they really were very young men. Tracy was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary organiser and that. So anyway, after 1916, the work of setting up the volunteers, if you like, moved on apace, and by 1918 there were 6 battalions in Tipperary, and that led to the formation of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And that happened, I think, in around June or sometime in 1918 in P.J. Maloney's house in Tipperary. And Dick Mulcahy, very interestingly, Dick Mulcahy came down from headquarters to preside over the formation of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And when you think of it, Dick Mulcahy was very much on the Free State side after. So the friendships were so sad the way they were sundered and all that at that time.
Was PJ married at that time?
Yeah, PJ married. PJ's 4 children were born before he moved to Tipperary. In fact, they were all born. I think the youngest, Paddy, was born in 1899, and I think the eldest, May, was born in 1895 or so. There were 4 children were born in fairly close succession. And but he was living in Limerick at that time, so he married about 1895 or around that time to Ellen Hannon, who had 4 children from a previous marriage. Her husband had died, and the Hannon thing became very interesting after, which I'll kind of get to. So PJ he brought his 4 children to Tipperary and set up his pharmacy in Tipperary town. And as I said, became very active in the setting up of the volunteers, and along with Louis Dalton and others. And well, they were more active on the Sinn Féin side of it, whereas his sons, Con particularly, and Jim, were more active in the setting up of the volunteers, because of the young man's game, I suppose. But the 3rd Brigade was formed in his house. So then PJ, he was obviously when the kind of War of Independence started then in January 1919, really kicked off, if you like, in Salahead Beg. The lads were very, most of them had been in jail by then and all of that for organising, and so his place became very much a kind of a hotbed. And just to give you an idea of, the way his life went at that time, he was elected to the first Dáil in the end of 1918. And indeed I have a sticker which I show you. Not a sticker because they weren't sticky at the time, but he had this is a lapel badge that was worn by his supporters at that time in 1918. It's quite I doubt if there's one of them anywhere else in the world now, but my aunt, who's still alive, or his granddaughter, at 93, discovered it in a book recently and gave it to me, so it's very much a family heirloom. But so he was elected, defeated a great nationalist, actually, a man by the name of John Cullinan from Banshire, who had been involved in the land wars and had been in jail and all that. But that was it. The Irish Parliamentary Party just ran out of steam at that time over their involvement over their position on the Great War and the Home Rule thing. So he attended then the first meeting in the Dáil on the 21st of January 1919. And at the same time, on that day, Salahead Beg took place. And his son, Con, was the adjutant of the brigade and was one of the organisers. So, but to kind of give you a feel for the things that happened to him, his son Paddy was arrested in March of that year and jailed in May. Dáil Éireann was declared illegal and went underground. Con was jailed in November. He was elected the Sinn Féin chairman of Tipperary Urban Council in 1920. He was arrested and spent in 1920, and from March to May he was in Wormwood Scrubs and did hunger strike. PJ did, and released then. And then his house was bombed on the 18th of October 1920, so the day Sean Tracy was buried. And then November the 13th, his house was burned down. And his son Paddy was shot dead in Guthrum in May 1921. So it was huge, I suppose. It was very deep involvement, and it kind of gets you to thinking why he took the anti-treaty side. He had given so much, I suppose, to break the link with the British Empire, that, as he said in his Dáil speech rejecting the treaty, he said he couldn't live between two hells. The two hells being occupation or the fallout of the treaty, which was still being part of the empire. So that was his thinking at the time. And you can, when you see all the things that happened, you can understand it. So that was PJ. He stood then. He was a member of the second and third Dáils, and then he didn't stand for the fourth Dáil. But in the meantime, Louis Dalton, who I mentioned, who was president of Sinn Féin in Tipperary and one of a very old nationalist family, his father actually, Louis Dalton's father, Michael Dalton, had an Irish language newspaper in Tipperary in the 1860s. I think there were about 7 editions of it. But he was a very staunch friend of William O'Brien and the whole Land League and the whole repeal movement and that. And so that's where and his other son, Michael O'B. Dalton. Indeed, you could do a whole program on the Daltons. Michael O'B. was one of the leaders of the Planet campaign in Tipperary town and the building of New Tipperary, which is a whole history project in itself. That was he and Father Dave Humphreys were the local leaders of that, and local leaders of the Planet campaign. In fact, it is said that the cost of building New Tipperary really broke the Planet campaign financially, nationally, which was basically a campaign to withhold rents from the landlords. So PJ then went back to his pharmacy business and lived until 1949. Stayed very strongly anti-treaty. He was a great friend of De Valera's and maintained his friendship with Dev, and died. When he died, Dev was at his funeral. On the other hand, Louis Dalton had married PJ's stepdaughter, Birdie Hannon. You remember Ellen had a family of 4 Hannons before she married PJ, and her daughter, PJ's stepdaughter, Birdie Hannon, married Louis Dalton. So you had the ardent anti-treatyite, PJ, whose stepdaughter was married to Louis Dalton, and Louis actually became a member of the 5th Dáil on the pro-treaty side. So there you have the history and the way the views diverged at the time, sincerely held on all sides. So that was PJ.
And PJ, was there any records of his activities during the Civil War?
Well, they were burned out, and they moved actually to Dublin. They were burned out before the Civil War, during the War of Independence, kind of towards the end of the War of Independence. And very interestingly, moved to Dublin, where they lived in a house given to them by Michael Collins. And my grandfather, Con, his son, was married out of that house in Haddington Road Church in Dublin. So, and right through, I remember my grandmother when she was alive, and she was Barlow now. She was Barlow, but she would never let anyone speak against Michael Collins, even though her son Con her husband Con was the Adjutant General of the Republican forces who opposed Collins. But the friendship, she maintained that friendship, and never forgot that when PJ was burned out, Collins gave him a house to live in Dublin. And she said, Now, I don't know when he came back from Dublin to live in Tipperary, but she always said that Collins never looked for the house back from them, even though they had taken totally different paths. So, so then to go on then with the family, Jim was the eldest of the boys. May at that time was training to be a doctor, and was actually lived in the house with her mother in somewhere around the South Circular, around Haddington Road. So I don't know exactly where the house was, but she went to college out of there, and and then she was an intern in I think it was Barrington's or John's Hospital in Limerick, and there she met her husband, who a chap by the name of Bob O'Neill, Alphonsus O'Neill. And Alphonsus was one of the O'Neill brothers who were really very involved in the Clare Brigade, and were involved in the famous Renine ambush, which was a huge ambush in West Clare, which involved in the burning of 3 towns in West Clare after, as a reprisal. But she met Bob there. Actually, sadly, she was the one who identified her brother when he was shot by the Black and Tans in Guthrum in 1920. And she was at home at the time in Tipperary. A month later, 2 months later, they were burned out. But
and do you know the circumstances and how or why he was shot? Retaliation for something, or was it an ambush? Or
it was said, and in fact it's still said around Salahead, that they were betrayed. You see, Guthrum, he was in Guthrum in their role in his father's home place. They had a farm in Guthrum. Actually, Guthrum is where Guthrum Mines was after. That was their farm. But it was in a long passageway, and he was in uniform for some reason, and they wouldn't have always been. They were at some activity, that their meeting or something that they had been at, but they came to Guthrum, himself and Sean Duffy, who was a Monaghan man, and he was the OC, I think, of the 4th Battalion in Tipperary. He was one of the leaders as well, and the house was surrounded. And they, like a lot of old houses at that time, there was only one door, there was no back door. They had to come out the front door, and they got up around the house, but they were both shot. But the word was that they were informed on, and apparently the person who did it was accounted for after. So that was Paddy. So going back to May, the eldest of the Maloney family, May qualified as a doctor. She was the dispensary doctor in Cappamore all her life. And her husband, Bob, was, as I say, one of the O'Neill family, very famous family in Clare, in the War of Independence. And he took the Free State side and was on Collins' staff, he and his brother, in the Civil War. And he retired, I'd say, as a commandant in the general demobilisation of the National Army in 1928. And Bob lived in Cappamore with May and lived out their lives. He was very big into greyhounds and all those things. He was a lovely man. I know him, and funny enough, there didn't seem to be any rancour in the family. Bob was, he was, whereas the boys were all very much on the Republican side, he was on the other side. But they seemed to get on, and, after. Now then I'll talk about Jim then. Jim was the eldest of the boys. Jim was very active in the 4th Battalion in Tipperary, and went on then, when Con became Adjutant General of the Republican forces in the Civil War, Jim came with him and became the Director of Intelligence. And after the Civil War, well, uh, I'll talk about before the Civil War ended. As I say, he went with Con and became involved on the Republican side during the Civil War, and they were in the Glen of Aherlow. Spent a lot of their time in the Glen towards the end of the Civil War, and in March 1923, Con and Jim and a great friend of theirs, Tom Conway, who was reared on the same street as him in Tipperary town, were surrounded in the Glen, and there was a gun battle, and both Con and Tom Conway were severely wounded and captured. Jim got away, and no, he didn't. He was captured as well. The three of them were captured, but Con and Tom Conway were seriously wounded. And by then, Con had become Deputy Chief of Staff. But he was obviously taken out of the whole decision-making process on ending the Civil War. Then he was in jail and that, and remained in jail and was on hunger strike until around the end of 1924.
That's quite long.
As was Jim. Oh yeah, there was 12,000 Republican prisoners in jail after the Civil War, and they were in jail for a year or more. Yeah, it became a huge problem for the government at the time, trying to deal with them, obviously, and they went on hunger strike. There were major hunger strikes. Jim led a major hunger strike in the Curragh, and Con was involved he was in Mountjoy. And he used to always say he did 39 days hunger strike, and our Lord did 40. He only beat him by a day. So that was he used to say thereafter. But Jim went on and married Katty Barry, a sister of Kevin Barry's, Kevin Barry of Mountjoy Jail and the song fame. He was actually the first person to be executed in the War of Independence. He was hanged in Mountjoy Jail. Kevin Barry. So Jim married Katty, and they remained to their death anti-treatyites, but they were anti-establishment. They were very much on the Republican view all their lives, and would have been involved in the setting up of Tána Publicta, and thereafter they never took we'll say PGA were very much sided with Dev and very involved in the setting up of Fianna Fáil and that. But Jim, his son, stayed more Republican. Katty was an absolutely ardent anti-establishment woman. She was a great character. I knew her at the end of her days. And they had a dairy in Dublin. And it was his mother, I think, Kevin Barry's mother, as far as I know, ran the dairy, and they supplied the milk from the farm in Carlow. There was a descendant of theirs. Kevin Barry was a Fianna Fáil councillor in Carlow. I'm sure that Barrys are probably still there. But
and did Jim come back to live in Tipperary?
Jim came back to live in Tipperary when they married. Jim married. Immediately they got out of jail in 1924. Jim and Katty married. And the reason they knew each other so well was that Katty was the link person between Dublin and the South during the Civil War. She spent an awful lot of her time in the South. And she also went to America fundraising with Maud Gonne. Oh, sorry, no, with Countess Markovich. And also, immediately after the Civil War, they got out of jail, Jim and she were married. And immediately after that, Dev sent him to to Australia, sent Katty, and I don't know who else was with her, fundraising to Australia. So at that time, she was very strongly pro-Dev and all that. But when Dev founded Fianna Fáil and went into the Dáil and took the oath, even though he said it was an empty formula, she broke with Dev at that time and stayed very much militant Republican, as did Jim, although he was the mildest, quietest man you ever met. You just a lovely gentleman. But they came back to Tipperary. Jim was a pharmacist. He had, I don't know how he got around to it, but with all their activity. But I suppose at that time, you kind of served your time to pharmacy. I don't think there was a university degree. You were probably an apothecary, I think was the thing. So Jim was a chemist anyway. He came back to Tipperary, and he and Cathy were in the business in Tipperary. But life intervened. In the meantime, PJ's wife, Ellen, had died, and PJ decided to marry again, and he married a Kennedy lady from Tipperary town, and it resulted in a break in the sense that whereas Jim and Cathy thought they were immediately going to run the business, PJ said no, he wanted to keep it up himself. So Jim and Cathy moved back to Dublin, and Cathy worked all her life in the Irish sweepstakes, and Jim worked eventually, and they went through hard times, and they went through times when they had very little, but Jim eventually got work with the Irish Sugar Company in Carlow, and he was there. He worked as a chemist in the Irish, I suppose, in the labs, and Cathy, as I say, was there. They lived in Winton Avenue in Rathgare, 4 Winton Avenue in Rathgare. It was a house I visited many times, and their family, they had 3 children. So that was Jim. Con then married Joan Barlow. Now the Barlows are Shook. Shook was outside Tipperary town on the road to Galway, and it was one of the main, if you like, meeting points or kind of local headquarters of the 4th Battalion of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. The 4th Battalion was probably the most active battalion. Certainly one of them, I'm sure people would dispute that, but it was a very active battalion of the 3rd Brigade. And the Barlow boys, Artie and Matt and Jack, were on their own and very involved. And their mother was Hogan, so that that connection was there as well. She was one of the Hogans of Ardavan, a brother of Tom Hogan, a sister of Tom Hogan, who was Vice President of Sinn Féin and who had died in 1918, who was married to Mary Dalton. So you could see all the tie-ups. So Joan Barlow married Con, and they had 4 children. One of whom was my mother, Josephine, who died 4 years ago. The other was Paddy. Paddy is dead a few years now. He was the only boy. And then you had Kathleen, who was dead a few years as well. She was Mrs. Condon from Clonmel, and Maureen, who's still alive. She's Maureen Dunn and lives outside Tipperary town, 93 years of age, and totally independent and has perfect recall. She's just a great person to meet and chat, and a great, if you like, resource when you're. Certainly when I was doing this and writing it up, she did a lot of fact checking for me. So
3 girls and a boy.
3 girls. What now? You had Kathleen. Oh, Eileen was the other. So 4 girls. God, I couldn't forget Eileen. Eileen was a staunch Republican all her life, and she was a nurse in the district hospital in Tipperary. Having been, both she and Kathleen trained as nurses during the Blitz, actually, in the Second World War in London, and Kathleen came back and married Billy Condon in Clonmel, and there's Condons there in Clonmel all the time, and Eileen didn't marry. She lived with her mother in Henry Street in Tipperary, and she's dead a number of years now. So that was the Maloney's. Con then, when they came out of jail, you see, as I told you, Jim came back to the pharmacy in Tipperary, and that didn't work out, and he went back to Dublin with Cathy. Con, so they couldn't get work. Any of the Republican people, the doors were closed to them, if you like. But Con, just as he got out of jail in 1924, he was appointed secretary of the county council. Now, at that time, the council officials were elected by the councillors. It's different now, but Con was elected, and it had to be ratified, of course, by the Minister for Local Government, and it was sent up, and it was rejected on the grounds that he wasn't considered to be a suitable person to hold that office. So he really, they found it difficult, but he eventually ended up as working for the Irish Public Bodies Insurance Company, which actually insures all the public bodies around Ireland. He was their, I guess, the guy who went out and got the business, and he was their assessor on that. And that was the Irish Public Bodies was set up by the Brennan family from Wicklow. And the Brennans were very nationalist family, and they were an anti-treaty family. You might remember Podge Brennan was a TD in Wicklow. He would have been connected with him. And actually Niamh Brennan, who's married to Michael McDowell, would be a descendant of that Brennan family. So he worked with them and died a very young man in 1961, I think. Con got a heart attack and died in Dublin. Again, I suppose, when you think of it, they were they went through a lot of hardship, and he died of a heart attack. On the 8th of March 1951, he was only 54. But interestingly with Con, when the emergency was declared in 1939, 39, he joined the army. He rejoined the army, and he was a commandant in the Eastern Command throughout the emergency, and came back out then and worked with Irish Public Bodies again. And died in 1951. He was only 54. So that was Con. So if I accounted for all the Maloney's, I have May qualified as a doctor. She married Bob O'Neill. She was a dispensary doctor in Cappamore. Jim married Cathy Barry, lived in Winton Avenue in Rathgar. And Con married Joan Barlow and had their families. And Paddy was shot in Gortrum, so that's the Maloney's. So you had the tie-up of the Hogans, the Daltons, the Barlows and the Maloney's, all very nationalist families going way back, and were all involved in the War of Independence. But the interesting thing was that while all on my side of the family all took the Republican side, that's the Barlows and the Hogans by and large were, but there were some others in the family took the pro-treaty side. And I suppose, who are we to second guess who was right and who was wrong? They were all people who held very sincere views and acted them out, So I suppose that's it. She know ill.
Time is a great thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a bit of love thrown in.
Yeah, well, I've always said that we'd say, I suppose, my generation, I'm the second generation after the people who took part in the War of Independence. I knew all the guys in Tipperary town as a young fella. I knew all the Fitzpatricks and the Barlows, the Barlows were my uncles and granduncles, and Mickey Fitzpatrick and Sean Fitzpatrick and Morris Crowe. They were all there. They were there when I was a child in Tipperary. I knew them all, and my mother, I suppose, then was the next generation. My mother was born in 1927. I mean, it was really right at the end of her sister, Eileen, actually was born during the Civil War. They were married in 1920, and in Haddington Road, as she was born during the Civil War. And by gosh, she was a staunch Republican all her life. But I always said that my generation, like, surely we shouldn't carry on the negativity, you know. We should respect the fact that the people who took the two sides in the Civil War did so from deeply held convictions and were doing their best for Ireland, and that's the way I look at it. So that's it.
You were talking with your grandfather.
Yeah, Con. He was. I didn't know him. He died. My mother says he died the day I learned to walk. I was born in 1949, and he died in 1951. He was only 54, but he was a very mild man. Never would get into any rancor or discussion. But when my mother asked him once about being on the run, you know, and all that, and what he said, there was a kind of a romance in it too for young fellows, you know. And he also said, you know, he said, when you think of it, he said, there was more killed in an hour in the Battle of the Somme than the whole War of Independence. That was the perspective he put on it, you know. But I would have loved to have known him. You know, it's a great pity that he died as such a young man. I know his brother Jim, again, a very mild, really lovely man, never got involved at all in any of the histrionics after, you know, but was very strongly pro-Republican all his life, as was his wife Kathy. Kathy was a firebrand, very strong, they very strongly involved in if you like, the more extreme Republican politics.
And Eileen sounded like a bit of a character.
Eileen was a great character. Eileen, as I say, she was a nurse. She trained as a nurse during she and Kathleen, her sister, trained as a nurse during the Blitz. But she nursed in Clonmel Road in Belfast. Came back to Tipperary then and lived there. She was very, very strong Republican. There was no doubt, and she was involved in bringing stuff and looking after the guys that were in Mountjoy during the recent troubles, and was very much involved in that Republican, the what we call a neo-republicanism. So well, she went down with her colours flying. She was very much a strong Republican.
Was there much talk of the women and what the women did during this whole period?
Women were very strong. My father, as I told you, my father's father, my grandfather, died in 1918 in the Great Flood. They died within a week of each other. And my father was reared at Barlow's in Shook because Mrs. Barlow was his aunt. She was Hogan. And so my father was only 6 when his parents died. He went to Shook as a child and went to Mount Bruce School. And when he was, you know, 1920, 21, he would have been 8 or 9 going to school. The TANs and the auxiliaries were constantly around Shook because they knew the lads were there a lot of the time. And he used to say that they'd open his sandwiches going to school to see if he had messages in them, you know. But they were very, you talk about the women, they were very strong. Mrs. Barlow Shook had to sell her cows because her husband had been dead. Her husband died in 1912, and the 3 boys were on their own. So she had no one to work the farm, and she had to sell her cows and to keep going. And neighbours were great. The neighbours actually took her cows, and she got them back when she got going again, you know. But she had to live through all that. Her daughter Joan, who was my grandmother, she was actually educated in England. and she was a teacher. I don't know if she ever taught, but she certainly didn't teach after marrying Con. But when she was, my father used to say that she was absolutely fearless. She'd face the Ogsies and the RIC coming into the house, and she'd throw water out of a basin out in the attic, and she'd see him coming in, and she was absolutely, she said, he often wondered how she wasn't shot. You know, totally fearless. And the women, you see, the women had to stay at home. The boys were on their own and were able to get away, but the women had to face them, and they were strong people, no doubt about that, you know. And they were everywhere. When you think right along the safe houses, they were the ones that had to face the RIC. They hated the RIC because they were Irish people, you know. And of course a lot of the informers and that came through that. Having said that, there were some great RIC people, and great. Funny enough, a lot of the guys who were on their own, and a lot of the volunteers, their parents were RIC, quite a number, and a lot of RIC were great supporters of the movement. But in general, they just hated the RIC. Because the RIC were there, you know, when you think of it, they were set up after the Act of Union, and they enforced landlordism and evictions and all that, so you can understand. And of course there was a huge amount of evictions and that kind of thing around Tipperary. There was a very, very strong anti-landlord, land league ethos around Tipperary, even though it was a garrison town. And one of the biggest garrisons in Munster was in Tipperary town. So you can imagine, we'd say the local economy in Tipperary town was probably totally supported by the barracks. The thousands, was it? I forget the name of the regiment that was there. The Sherwood Foresters, I think. They were, but you can imagine and even during the First World War, when the First World War started, it became a major area for both recruitment and convalescence. So much so that they had to take houses outside the barracks. It was that big to hold all the soldiers. So you can imagine the economy of Tipperary, and yet to probably one of the most militant towns in Ireland on the volunteer side. The 4th Battalion of the 3rd Brigade was one of the most active in Ireland. I suppose you've the opposite reactions, like, but they fought landlordism. There was, you know, there was a major battle in Ballycohy outside Tipperary with a hated landlord, Scully. That only happened in the late 1800s, you know, so it was very much there, you know. And then of course the planning campaign, the whole building a new Tipperary, and the land war and the rejection of the Smith-Barry estate and all that. So yeah, nationalism and, you know, support for the British Army. They lived side by side. And you can imagine in Tip then the intermarriage, you know, soldiers married local women, and all the bitternesses and issues that caused. Again, Cupid raising his head and shooting his arrow regardless of where the allegiances were of the family, you know. So that's it.